Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the Lux Executive Summit. I chose a small problem to attack today, and that is the nature of innovation and how we all do it. And specifically, this is a collective challenge that I think we as a company, my company, but you and your organizations all face, which is how to be more efficient and more effective innovators. And as you can tell from the title of my talk, I'm going to talk about how we can use a combination of data and insight to get us there. Okay? So the agenda for today, as we like to do here, is in 3 parts. The first one is really talking about some examples and some data points that show us how the process of innovation, and from our work with our clients like you, a lot of things haven't changed, certainly over the past, say, 5 years. So we'll talk about how a little bit about that process needs to evolve. Then we'll talk about this combination of data and insight. And I really want to use it to answer some kind of distilled innovation questions. And that is, what technologies should we work on? Who should we work with? And when should we act? So really, we have many complicated frameworks and all these things. We wanted to really distill things down into some simple questions that we can attack. And finally, with that as some examples, what are some tools we can use? What are some ways we can build our teams? What are the ways we can change our behavior? So how can we evolve to really get the best results? So first, I want to start off with an analogy. My first question is, who knows what this is a picture of? Few people, so not many baseball fans. This is a picture of the Houston Astros after they won the World Series last October. Okay? And so the reason why I've chosen the Astros as an analogy for this is because they are really a poster child for the combination of data and insight to build a winning organization. So if you look at some of the headlines that popped around the time that they won the World Series, there was a lot about how big data won the World Series, how the Astros were leading in analytics and using numbers, really touting their advanced analytics program and how they built their organization around this. But as I said, the title of my talk has data plus insight in it. So let's take a step back and think about how intelligence in baseball has traditionally worked. So the way that baseball has traditionally scouted players, for example, is using experienced, seasoned veteran scouts like this, sitting in the stands, watching players, trying to decide if they fit the bill in terms of their capabilities and their skill set. So that's kind of a traditional approach, very much finger to the air instinct, relying on expertise. When people say advanced analytics, there was the Moneyball movie with Brad Pitt. That was actually quite a while ago. Things have evolved even from there to a much more really extreme level of analytics. So you don't need to read this graph in detail, but what it is actually analysis of the different launch angles and velocities of the ball off the bat. So we're not just saying that guy hits the ball 1 out of every 3 times. We're actually measuring how fast they hit it, what trajectory they hit it at, and how that correlates with the success of the team. Okay, so we've really gone from a very traditional insight-based system to a far more data-driven perspective. But the answer isn't just to hire a bunch of statisticians. So we really need to understand, and I like this quote because it's just as relevant, I think, for baseball as it is for our own organizations. So analytics is about helping player development, managers and coaches to make better decisions than what your competitors are making. I think that's exactly true for you and me. And so it's not just data, it's also the insight. So we can't just hire, again, a bunch of statisticians to get us through this and number crunch our way to success. This is an example of how the Astros actually layered on insight from a strategic standpoint to become a winning organization. So what happened was they hired a new general manager at the end of 2011. This person, while driven by analytics, his name is Jeff Lunau, not only recognized that analytics were important, but he also had the strategic insight to know that basically, if they could stomach losing for a few years, that would put them in a much better position to build a stronger team in the future. And so what he did was layered this insight onto the actual performance of the team while building an analytics platform. And basically, you can look at the results. We've got 2012, terrible year. 2013, they hit rock bottom. But then you start to see a steady upswing. So his actual strategy of essentially tanking to put themselves in a better position to win worked perfectly, culminating in a World Series title in 2017. So backed by data and insight, the Astros really built a winning organization. And that's the analogy I'm going to draw today to the innovation process. So how many of you know what this is? I'm expecting more hands this time. Yeah. So this is the innovation funnel. If you look closely, I found this actually humorous because the innovation funnel is so ubiquitous now that there's templates like this online where you just fill in the blanks. Okay? So I would argue that this is a useful tool, but the way we use it, the way we stage out our process is in many ways akin to the traditional scout who uses gut and instinct to make the best decisions. Okay? So what's the evidence to back this up? Well, we look at, we periodically have surveyed our clients to ask them how they think their innovation process is going, what they're seeing. And I want to contrast two data sets, one from 2013 and one from 2018. So we actually asked our clients, many of you in the audience actually, how do you think you're doing in terms of innovation? How do you think the success of your program compares to industry peers? And a quite surprising number of you actually said, were pretty pessimistic and said, you know what, I think our peers are doing better than us. So there wasn't this resounding, we are crushing it. You know, we are really owning this process and really showing the greatest success we can. Sticking with, these are actual quotes from back then, which happen to align with the baseball theme. I don't have any home runs. I've got quite a few singles and doubles. Some that are growing could become a triple or a home run. We find a lot of singles, haven't found a home run, like a recurring theme. Little wins, but not the big win, okay? Fast forward to 2018. This is a survey of a similar style that was done by Innovation Leader, which is a magazine, and they surveyed a bunch of innovation leaders. And what struck me was in looking at this list of top priorities, it's a lot of the same things we heard 5 years ago. Struggling to spot the most important emerging technologies, difficulty rolling technologies out into the business, difficulty getting executive buy-in for your efforts. So it really struck me that the tone and the themes coming out of these types of analyses of how innovation is going, we're still hearing the same complaints. There's not a resounding, yes, we are crushing this. So what we need to do is do this better. And that's my argument. And that goes for me personally, that goes for my company, and that goes for you and your companies. How can we solve this problem? The solution, we believe, is a combination of data and insight. As you see, that'll be a recurring theme throughout this conference. So what are some characteristics of how these approaches work? Well, there's traditional insight, or traditional foresight. We have examination of broad themes like megatrends. We study markets. We study technology trends. And ultimately, we rely on hiring smart people to make smart judgments. What are the challenges of this? Well, people are vulnerable to bias. You can miss things. It's easy to miss key trends. And oftentimes, you miss the signal, and you're often lagging in terms of what's really happening. More recently, we see the emergence of these more data-driven approaches. Rely on the data, crunch the data, give us insights that fall out of the data. And these are more of an automated approach. So what are some characteristics of this? Well, we access a lot of different data sources, a lot of data at our fingertips. We look for trends and correlations, let the statistics do the work for us. We have nice search interfaces, beautiful visualizations, different ways of showing landscaping and hotspots and things like that. What are the challenges from this? Well, this is swinging to the other side of the spectrum. We're lacking context and insight. Oftentimes, we've got a lot of information, but it's too much to actually sift through. And again, we have the issue of it often being a lagging indicator. So we still haven't found this perfect solution to the innovation problem. And what we need to do is find a way to synthesize them both together. Because both, if we take the best of both worlds, we should and can be more effective. So what are the perils of traditional insight? So I'm going to, just a few case studies of where each approach has gone wrong. Well, this is kind of a canonical story about a take gone wrong. But in the early 80s, McKinsey actually told AT&T that there would be about 900,000 mobile phones at the turn of the century, total, global market. In reality, at the turn of the century, there was 900,000 mobile users adding to the network every 3 days. So this is meaningful because AT&T actually made a strategic decision based on that forecast. They later backtracked and changed their strategy, but they certainly lost a chance to take a leadership position. So orders of magnitude off in terms of the result, right? That's difficult when you're making strategic decisions. Again, and these are smart people. This is more pointing to the fact that traditional insight's fallible, right? We can miss things, or we can be wrong. Another example, Gartner, really well-respected firm. They know what they're doing. There's an article from 2006, shortly before, really, a couple years before the iPhone came out, saying that Apple should quit the hardware business. We can play Monday morning quarterback on that one as well. But again, this is really to show you the limitations or some of the drawbacks of a traditional insight-driven approach. On the other side, let's swing to this automated way of gathering data. Many of you use this tool every day. Maybe you think about it, maybe you don't. This is one of the most powerful versions of artificial intelligence that are at your fingertips, and it's really a Google search. And so the issue with this is we hear a lot of complaints from our clients that believe news is a critical input into their innovation work. But I think we've all used Google Alerts, for example. Let's say you wanted to track the innovation and strategy from a technology perspective of Toyota. You ever punch Toyota into a Google News search? Yes, you get the odd, Toyota launches a fuel cell bus. That's relevant information. You get things about do-it-yourself projects for charity. You get stuff about dealerships. You get stuff about apparently driving a car that'll kill you. Who knows what these articles about, right? They don't help you sift through what's important. So it's a tool, it's automated, it's delivered to your inbox every day, but you gotta sift through a bunch of junk. So automation by itself can also fail. Back to the solution. Can we take the best of both worlds and combine a data-driven approach with the insight we need to actually make actionable decisions? And so our perspective is expert curation of data and advanced analytics. We need the data science. We need it. But we also need to have the experts that know how to interpret it. We need domain knowledge, exactly that, to sort what's significant from what's not. And then what does it mean? Our clients often ask the so what. What do we do about this? What is the consequence of this? We really need to be able to go the next level in terms of how we draw and act on things. And I'll close this section by saying, I'd be happy if, as a group, we could improve our win rate, we could make our wins bigger, and ultimately make our activities indispensable to the growth of our companies. Again, the recurring theme is getting executive buy-in, rolling things out into the business. Can we be indispensable? Can our value be unquestioned in terms of what we bring to our corporations? With that, I want to talk a little bit about how we can take some examples of data plus insight to answer these fundamental innovation questions of who, what, who, and when. So again, basic questions. Not reinventing the stage gate. I'm not reinventing the innovation funnel. 3 simple questions. What should we work on? How do we find the next thing that's worth our time? Once we've found what to work on, who do we work with? How do we identify partners? How do we identify investment targets? And when do we act? So really, 3 simple distilled questions about the innovation process that I think if you thought about the things you do every day, oftentimes they align around kind of basic questions like this. So we'll start by walking through each of these questions, showing you how a data alone approach or an insight alone approach can fail, and then showing how a combination of those two things can make us more effective. So what? What should we work on? Pretty simple question. What are some ways we do this today? There are some really interesting frameworks. The Gartner hype cycle, I know this is a popular one. A lot of people use it. Unquestionably a brilliant framework. It's a really interesting way to think about the trajectory of innovation. But is it always right? And as you could probably guess, the answer is no, because it's still built by people who can still miss things, right? So let's take an example. This is from an article that it's a very interesting read by Michael Mullaney from Icon Ventures. You can look it up, or I'm happy to send it to you if you're interested. But he actually looked through the historical performance of the hype cycle. And he actually called out one example that really stood out as kind of violating the trajectory that the hype cycle should show. And that's for mesh networks. The idea of building a network where you can hop from access point to access point, kind of self-healing networks. And lots to see here, but the basic point here is that the technology doesn't follow that curve that you would expect. And so I'll pick 3 data points just to show you that or illustrate that. 2003, it's on the upswing of the cycle, heading towards the peak. From a timeline perspective, 2 to 5 years to plateau. Okay. So that's where we started in 2003. 1 year later, it's actually traversed to the other side of the peak. But actually, interestingly, it's 5 to 10 years from plateau now. So the timeline has shifted. Okay, so readjusting our calibration. Jump forward 6 years to 2010, it's actually gone backwards, back toward the peak. And now it's more than 10 years away from plateau. So it's an interesting example how the winds change, adoption doesn't go as planned. It's hard to really identify with a framework that's qualitative the exact trajectory of technologies. And so his takeaway quote is, it's remarkable the number of major technologies from the past 20 years that were either identified late or actually just never appeared. And it's not because they're not smart, it's just because it's really hard to identify every technology out there and know which way it's going to go. Another way, a pure data-driven approach to what technology should you prioritize. VC data. Not saying it's useless, because we use it, I know you use it, it's a useful data point. But we do have to be cognizant of its limitations. So we have seen lots of graphs like this. Here's the investments over time. Here's the trajectory and the trends. I spoke to a VC in my network. This is not a blanket statement for all VCs. But this particular person was telling me about the nuances of how due diligence works. And the person told me, if you saw the level of due diligence in vetting some of these companies, you'd be appalled. Kind of removing the luster or the sheen or the myth of Silicon Valley. While there are some very rigorous, very successful VCs, there are some investments that are made with probably less due diligence than you'd think. Let's look closer. So if we really want to rely on VC data, we have to ultimately trust their decision-making and their results. So there was a really interesting study out of the MIT Energy Initiative that looked at venture capital in clean tech. And as you can guess from the takeaway, the title, they came away saying that the VC is actually the wrong model for clean energy innovation. And they actually had a lot of data points behind this to show you the actual performance of VCs in different sectors. So there's 2 graphs here. One is the internal rate of return. One is essentially return on investment. And a bit of an eye chart, but the major takeaway is that clean tech severely underperformed compared to software for the VC community. The return on investment is smaller. The internal rate of return is smaller. And so the high-level takeaway here was that VCs are pretty good at identifying software opportunities. Not as good at hard tech, things that involve long timelines, things that involve a lot of CapEx. These are harder, and they behave a lot differently than software companies do. So we have to think about the performance overall in terms of different sectors and different strengths. So those are some of the important data points we can use, but there are limitations to them. what is the proposal, or what is a way that we might be able to get around this or be more effective? And this is the idea of data plus insight. And so what I want to introduce here is something that many of you have seen, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but is the Lux Tech Signal, which is our approach to using a data lake to actually help us understand what technologies are coming. In short, we wanted to come up with a figure of merit for innovation, and we call it the innovation interest. And it's basically the compilation through data science of a bunch of data sets that we all already use. Patent trends, investment trends, academic papers, government funding, our own database. So we have an algorithm that basically rolls these all together and generates a curve. And this curve, for example, is for machine learning, deep learning, and deep networks. And you can see an increasing trajectory. We can learn a lot from how it changes over time. If there are inflection points, it may point to an acceleration of a technology. So there's a lot of interesting information, and I'll show you some ways that we've kind of dug into this data to see how it actually works and if it is helpful. And we know it is. So the most prominent deliverable or research we've done that's based around the tech signal is the 18 for 2018. Combining results from the Lux Tech Signal with the insight of our analysts, we came up with the top 18 technologies that we think will disrupt the world over the next 10 years. So you see machine learning and deep neural networks, which is going to be a big topic of this conference. At number 1, we see a variety of different technologies across materials, across energy, across digital. But really, this was a fundamental attempt to take data from the Lux Tech Signal, take the insight from our analysts, and come to an idea of what the top technologies to watch are. But we can take this tool later. So a list of technologies is great. That should inform us. It should spark conversation. It should make us think about our priorities. How do we dive deeper? Well, we took that same data lake of all that data that I talked about, and we actually plotted it in a different way. This is for all of the materials research that is going on at Lux, all the different categories, topics that we cover. And we actually plotted on the y-axis innovation track record, which is essentially cumulative activity in terms of number of papers and patents. That also correlates with the size. So essentially, the higher up it is, or the bigger it is, the more mature it is. And then that innovation interest, which is really a measure of momentum, if you will. So we can plot this out in a 2x2 space, and we can start to see some trends emerge. There's some mature stuff like carbon fiber. The stuff up here is stuff you probably already have activities in. They're more mature. You have more mature programs. As you go down, you start to see more emerging technologies that are popping up. So different kinds of coatings, metal organic frameworks, and so on. But we can use a 2x2 like this to say, there's the mature stuff where we're probably managing programs, but there's also a sweet spot of things that are coming, things that we should be working on if we're not, or that we should be investing more in if we're not. And so from a materials perspective, the examples here are things like metamaterials, 3D scanning, 3D printing. That's one obviously far to the right because of the momentum it has right now. But this helps us bubble to the top some of the emerging innovations that are in that sweet spot. Great, so we've taken it one step down, still using data to map this out. Let's go one level deeper. So I've seen what the emerging technologies are. Now let me pick one and drill into it. So we started with data at a high level, and we're starting to filter down, down, and down. So materials informatics, that's the case study I'll use. We want to go deeper into materials informatics. Short primer, what's materials informatics for anybody who's not familiar? It's the use of data science and AI to extract insights from existing materials and ultimately help us find the next materials that we should be making. It really accelerates R&D for developing new materials. It can extract value from the huge amounts of data we already have in our R&D programs. And it really can optimize experimental designs. So you can see it's starting to peak. It's rising quickly in terms of the Lux Tech Signal. A lot of the activity is in academic papers compared to patents, so it's still more a fundamental research stage. So We identified materials informatics. We'll keep going down this funnel. Let's go one step deeper than that and say, within materials informatics, what materials platforms are ready for prime time? So we actually then use our analyst insight, pick up the phone, we do surveys. We actually probe which platform or application is most ready for materials informatics. And we looked at different metrics like data availability, data cleanliness, how mature is it for machine learning. And we actually see an interesting trend play out where small molecules bubbles to the top in terms of a technology that is ready for materials informatics and would be a great place to start. Whereas something like batteries or catalysts, it's more difficult right now because of the data sets and the cleanliness and some of the issues around that. So this helps us really keep going deeper, deeper, and deeper. Start with the data, layer on the insight. Now we want to attack the question of who. So through the exercise I just did, we've identified what we want to work on. Now we want to know who to work with. What are some traditional ways to do this? Again, what are some of the drawbacks of the way we typically do this? One is, frankly, following the hype or following the publicity cycles. I'm going to take an example of Magic Leap. In 2015, Magic Leap was a top 10 breakthrough technology. MIT releases this every year. It's a fun read. Top 10 breakthrough technologies. Magic Leap, if you're not familiar, is a mixed reality company making hardware for mixed reality. Jump forward to 2017. They missed a bunch of product deadlines, never delivered. They actually just recently this year delivered a product just for developers, but way, way, way behind schedule. And my colleague Tracy Wu actually dug into their patents, dug into their performance, dug into their team. And this is the kind of high-level quote that I like from this study was, since then, the shiny veneer of this unicorn has started to crack, and its claims appear to be highly exaggerated. So again, we can follow the money, we can follow the hype, but you gotta look a little bit closer to see what's really there and what's not. An even more drastic example of this is Theranos. Revolutionizing diagnostics is a story I think almost everybody knows at this point. If you remember, in 2015, around that time frame, there were lots of breathless articles about how Elizabeth Holmes was essentially the next Steve Jobs, right? Gonna revolutionize diagnostics. Fast forward to 2018, a lot of bumps along the way here. But essentially, the SEC charged Elizabeth Holmes with fraud because they basically faked results or they misled their investors, misled their customers. And again, $9 billion valuation went to nothing. So something propped this thing up to $9 billion. And it was all smoke and mirrors, right? So there's still a lot of errors that can be made here. From a data perspective, kind of automated landscaping, we see a lot of these landscape maps where we can segment a technology, we can say who the key players are. We've done this. The example I want to show you is we did a blockchain landscape where we looked at horizontal versus vertical solutions, all the different core enablers, et cetera. These are useful to a point. They do help you with the landscaping. That's why we like them. But if you're trying to answer this question of who, it doesn't tell you who to work with. It's a bunch of logos. And we do them, so we know that. But they're insightful, but we want to know who to engage with. We need to go a level deeper. So we need the data plus the insight to get us there. So one thing that we've been working on within our software and data science team is the use of data to help us surface the leading companies in different segments. So this is an example for deep learning, where we actually used patents, investments, and academic publications to surface the leading players in 3 segments: large players, startups, and research centers, right? You may look at large players more as competitors, but sometimes partners. Startups absolutely are investment targets, they're partnership opportunities, and similarly with research centers. So we're trying to segment out the key players here using data to surface them. But we can also cut the data different ways. We can look at funding, we can look at patents. This is a subset of deep learning, which is machine vision or computer vision. So the idea of essentially using deep learning essentially for vision applications. We can do text signals and look at the discrete curves. The green one here is deep learning for computer vision, which you can see is rising. So these things are pointing us from deep learning towards computer vision applications of deep learning. Then we have discrete data points like SoftBank leading a Series B investment into a company. So this further points us towards who we should work with. But we don't want to stop there because we know if you're going to make a decision, you can't base it just on this kind of data. So that's when, this is my colleague Kyle Landry, who leads our robotics research. Pick up the phone and call him. And that's where our company profiles pop up. And a lot of you have seen these. I'm not going to dwell on what they look like inside, but what does Nauto do? We get at their technology and differentiators. It's a two-way camera that uses deep learning to understand what's outside the vehicle and what's inside the vehicle. Right now, they're attacking fleet applications, what their pricing is, what their business model is going to evolve to. And ultimately, our conclusion that we think this is a unique solution that leverages deep learning for insight in and out of the car, culminating in a Lux take of positive. So we have different ways of surfacing key players. We do want to use data to help us get those to the top. Then we need to go deeper. You're going to do that, we're going to do that, and together we can make the right decision on whether it's worth our time. Interestingly, the primary research we do actually turns into its own data set. So we actually score companies. And this is what we call a Lux Innovation Grid for deep learning. And as you can see, based on all the conversations we've had and the ratings we give, we have another data set now that we've created, which helps us know who the leading players that we like are, which will be in the upper right quadrant. And not surprisingly, Nauto, the company was the example I gave, finds itself in the upper right quadrant. So it's kind of a storyline of weaving our way towards who we should work with. And the last question, which you could argue is maybe the hardest one, which is when should we act? When should we do something about this? And the example I want to give is something that we at Lux have spent a lot of time on for years. That's by now kind of an older story, but it's a really fascinating one. And that's the competition between electric vehicles and fuel cells. Traditional foresight. How was this normally done? It's done with market sizes. Market sizes tell you something's going to be big in the future, meaning I should do something about it now. It's kind of a timing. So this is a market size I found for fuel cell vehicles that came out in 2011. It has a few data points saying there would be 57,000 fuel cell vehicles sold in 2015, over 150,000 vehicles sold in 2017. Does anyone know, even roughly, how many fuel cell vehicles have been sold through 2018? Less than 5,000. Very close. Just about 6,500 total fuel cell vehicles. So there's a question, right? Is a bad market size better than no market size? So it's something to think about in terms of helping guide us in our decisions. So this is, again, we're talking not slight misses, orders of magnitude misses, right? So this is tough. And this is an input into decision making. It's not the only input. So we got really interested in whether we could use tech signal to look at not just the trajectory of the technology, but whether there was any kind of component that gives us a forward indication of adoption. So this is an ongoing study where we're doing a lot of case studies to understand the correlation between tech signal and adoption. But I wanted to show you one and how that shook out. So blue curve is the innovation interest, this figure of merit for innovation for electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids, rising pretty significantly from 2006 on. Innovation interest for fuel cell vehicles in yellow, flat over time, hasn't really budged at all. So let's map onto that market adoption. This is the sales of EVs and plug-in hybrids through 2016. And as you can see, it's risen fairly in line with that tech signal. So there's been a big leap from 2005 to roughly 2012. There's a lag, but then the market took off as well. And so just, we can look at the data and say, roughly speaking, there's about a 6-year advance notice from tech signal towards forward indication of adoption. And so the natural question is, sure, you cherry-picked the one that works. There's probably a bunch that don't. I'm not going to say that it works every time, but I say we've done this in enough cases where there is a really interesting correlation between this signal and market adoption. So similarly, fuel cell vehicles remain flat. I personally don't think they're going anywhere. There's still a lot of ardent advocates for fuel cells, but I wouldn't expect this to spike much more at all. So what are some other case studies we use to try and find a correlation between tech signal and market impact? We looked at Bitcoin. All the stuff in blue is rising forward indicators, so positive trajectories. The stuff in black is actually where the tech signal went down, so innovation dropped off. So interestingly, not only were we able to see a lag, a forward indication of things like Bitcoin adoption, tight oil, even quinoa in the food world, but we actually could see the decline in diesel coming. So you see a precipitous drop-off of the tech signal for diesel in about a 5-year time frame. And if you guys have been looking at the reports for diesel adoption in Europe this quarter, it's been atrocious. So we're starting to see some correlation between these things. DVD decline, I think we all know that story. So this is a really interesting tool that we want to keep digging at, finding the correlations in terms of helping us with timing, right? So the last thing I want to do is put it all together for a case study. And actually, the example I want to take is some research that's been done by my colleagues Sarah Olson, Noah Gerson, Tommy Hayes, looking at the microbiome. And specifically, the impact of what the microbiome is the impact of microbes in different environments to aid the development of ingredients, therapeutics, and diagnostics. So in particular, I'm going to talk about the human gut microbiome as an example. The question of what? So we had this 18 for 2018. Microbiome actually made it into the top 5. So this helps us orient that microbiome is something worth spending time on. But as always, as I pointed out, we need to go deeper than that. So how do we layer on some insight? So this is a framework that my colleagues built where they looked at the level of personalization for giving diet recommendations for consumers, personalization, specificity on the bottom axis, frequency of recommendations on the y-axis. And you can see essentially, and I certainly recommend you talk to my colleagues if you want to dig into this, but the short story is the left side of this graph is inputting things like preferences, traits, dietary needs. So you put in an input, tells you what you should eat. When you really want to get specific about personalization, you start getting into biomarkers, genetics, and on the far right, the microbiome. And because the stuff on the left is easier, you see more players. So what I want to drill into is this question of what? Microbiome, we've said, yes, that's something we want to work on. But we also see, with the frequency of recommendations, there's this big gap in terms of a product development opportunity, in terms of being more continuous in the recommendations we can give. The reason why this is important is because the microbiome changes. If you do what day 2 does, day 2 takes a sample, you mail it in, sends you the result. That's one snapshot in time. If you could actually measure the evolution of your microbiome in real time, for example, or on a continuous basis, then you'd get a lot more insight into how things change. So we figured out the what, and we figured out even within the what, a particular problem to solve. So who should we work with? Well, we can then look at some interesting developments on the academic side. So I showed you that key player map where we can use things like academic papers to bubble key players to the top. So what this group at RMIT in Australia has done is actually develop an ingestible sensor. It's essentially like a pill that has wireless connectivity, connects to a receiver in your pocket, which is then connected to Bluetooth over your phone. So you can get more frequent recommendations about the gas evolution in your gut. So they can measure oxygen, hydrogen, carbon dioxide. They want to add future features from a sensing standpoint in version 2 and version 3. And then they want to not just provide data, but provide insight, right? What does the data mean? What should I do about it? And it's really unique in terms of, so we actually interviewed the developers, and it's unique in providing localized high-frequency measurements of the microbiome. And they're being spun out into a company called Atmo Biosciences. So now we've cycled through. Who should we work with? We know the what, it's the microbiome. We even know the gap from a product perspective. Now we have who. And this, we identified a big gap in terms of product development opportunity. That example drops right into it. So this really helps us, from a systematic standpoint, get to who we should be working with. And the last example is, if we think there's a predictive component or a forward indication of adoption, let's try it for the microbiome. Let's put our chips down and say, we think adoption might be coming in a certain amount of time. So this is the tech signal for microbiome. As you can see, it's got this really nice increasing curve. Remember, this is patents, publications, all those data sets rolled into one metric. So let's make a prediction. You can tell me in 7 years if I'm wrong. But basically, we found that with all the examples we've gone through, there's roughly a 5 to 7 year time frame. We also take the input of our analysts who say, well, XYZ technology is not really ready for prime time, so we expect it to be on the latter end. So we combine the data and the insight to say, about a 7 year advance. So we're looking at more substantial market impact of the microbiome or technologies attacking the microbiome in 2022, 2023. So I want to wrap up by talking about how we're evolving and ultimately some strategies for how we can be more efficient and more effective. You might do it this way, you might not, but I really want you to walk away with rethinking how you do things and whether we can, as a group, be more efficient. So how can we be the Astros? How can we be celebrating like this? Now, remember, they were not a one or the other proposition. The Astros had data, advanced analytics, but they also had the insight to say, let's just stomach some losing so that we can win in the future. So our solution, our perspective on how we can help you and how we can be most effective in the innovation process is taking our Lux Intelligence Engine, which is our software development platform, and build new ways of finding information. And the way we're doing that is something called technology pages. And I'll give you, this is actually going to be available in your app if you want to see a prototype for deep learning as the example. It'll be available in your app during the break, I believe. So what these are analyst curated, but also data-driven. So this is a snapshot of what it looks like. There's deep learning as the topic, a little description, what's new in terms of the data sources, news, patents, academic papers, investment rounds. We want to make sure we're not just dumping data on your doorstep. We want to give you what you should think about it, or at least what we think about it, so that it can inform your opinions. So why it matters, how it works, who the key players are, what are the challenges. This is an example where I showed you that deep learning map. It came right from this tech page. Use data, patents, publications, et cetera, to surface the leading players. And we can look at them from segments of large players, startups, and research centers. Finally, well, not finally, another aspect we want to touch upon is how do people use the technology? So that you could look at all the data you want, but it doesn't tell you how it's actually used. So we actually want to then have analysts go in and dive into case studies of how the technology is being deployed. This is an example for deep learning. Google, BASF, Toyota, all using deep learning in different ways. So this really can help inform you of the possibilities for a technology. And again, patents. We know that patents are a key tool. We can look at patent trajectories. Future development, we want to look at more how the technologies break down within the patents. Ultimately, you'll see layered on here things like called the Lux take, which is, again, gave you a data set. Here's our interpretation of that data set. Same thing with venture capital investment. Again, I gave you an example of why you should be cautious about it. Doesn't mean it's not useful. It does help you surface certain trends. So we do want to use an algorithm to bubble to the top recent investments that are of note in an area. So Toyota, NVIDIA, Grab in this case. So to wrap up, we really need to think about innovating the innovation process. Again, it doesn't have to be exactly the way I outlined it, but really agreeing that it needs to be something we can do better and more efficiently and more effectively. So we need more and we need bigger wins. I'd love it in future years for this conference if we could do that same survey, and no one's complaining about rolling stuff out into the business, and no one's complaining about executive buy-in, right? It might be something we're always dealing with, but can we get better? Can we make ourselves indispensable to the process and the growth of our companies? To be clear, data is an asset here. And you need to be thoughtful about how you use it, where you get it, how you analyze it, whether you build the right talent to gather that information, or who the vendors are that can provide it to you. But to be clear, is AI going to replace all decision-making from an innovation process? My 2 cents is no. It can help us do it better, and it can help us do it more efficiently, but it does not displace expertise and insight. That's the value you guys bring to your organizations. And finally, when thinking about process, when thinking about how we do it, we have intricate stage gates and innovation funnels. Really be systematic. Equip your team with the best tools and train them to think systematically and back up the intuition with data. Really think about how we can supplement the finger in the air, the instinct, the gut, the intuition with data sets. And with that, thanks.